Well, it is my honor to introduce a man who probably needs no introduction. I'm sure you all know Jim McGlone. Jim is an urban forest conservationist who recently retired from the Virginia Department of Forestry. He helped found Fairfax Master Naturalist Program. He was my chapter advisor when I went through the Master Naturalist Program. He helped start Plant Nova Natives. And in addition to being a wealth of knowledge on forest and tree ecology, he's also been practicing conservation landscaping in his own yard for the last 20 years, which will be important later in his presentation. So without any further delay, Jim, it is all yours.
Thank you, Trish. So, good morning, everybody. Thank you for choosing to get up early, especially if you stayed up late to watch the aurora last night. Today, we're going to talk about the importance of native trees. This is a subject that's been near and dear to my heart for a long time, and so I'm glad to share this information with you. Before we get into specifically native trees, let's talk about some of the general benefits of trees. And I divide tree benefits into two sections. One is the life cycle benefits. These are things that trees do as they photosynthesize, as they process sugars and go through their life. They do a lot of things that we find beneficial, but these are things that trees would continue to do whether there were people around to appreciate and benefit from what they're doing. A lot of what the tree's life cycle is about processing carbon. They take in carbon dioxide, they go through photosynthesis, they make sugars, they burn those sugars, and in cellular respiration. Most of the tree is made up of carbon compounds. Lignin and cellulose are both natural polymers, but they also, so we know the tree is made up of a lot of carbon, but what most people don't realize is that trees are injecting a lot of carbon into the soil. I mentioned cellular respiration, which is the process of burning those sugars, and a byproduct of that for the trees is carbon dioxide. And a lot of that gets released into the soil through pores in the root system, where it combines with other chemicals in the soil to form stable carbon compounds. So a lot of the carbon storage is not just the biomass of the tree, but it's also from their interactions with the soils. They're also putting a lot of sugar into the soil to attract beneficial fungi and bacteria that help them. In the case of the mycorrhizal fungi, they're helping to attract or to absorb water and nutrients, but they're also helping to protect the root system from pathogens. Another part of what trees do is they release a lot of water vapor into the air through a process we call transpiration. This leads to evaporative cooling, which can reduce the ambient heat and reduce the amount of energy we use to cool our homes. Shading does the same thing. And in the winter, trees can block winter winds and reduce heating by keeping the area warmer. When they do the gas exchange to pull in the carbon dioxide they need for photosynthesis, they also take in a lot of pollutants that would otherwise we would have to breathe in and irritate our lungs. Their surface areas reduce air particulates, and they also reduce runoff, which is really important for our streams, because a lot of the water pollution we're experiencing in Fairfax County in Northern Virginia, as well as the Chesapeake Bay, is from the amount of extra runoff we put into our streams every time it rains. And they help build soil structure by working with this, interacting with the soil ecosystem. This helps water infiltrate into the soil. It helps store soil and the carbon, but it also, the sugars that they use to attract beneficial microbes are also fueling the soil ecosystem which is what's cleaning the water before, as it filters through the soil before it comes out. And of course, trees are really good for wildlife, and we'll talk more about that particularly later on. So these are the things that trees do in the course of their lives that we find beneficial. But there are a lot of things that trees do for us that only benefits we get from trees that only occur because we interact with trees. Back in 2014, Kathleen Wolf and a couple of other researchers published an overview of about 50 years of study of how trees interact with people and their effect on stress, wellness, and physiology. I know 2014 is a little bit dated, but that gives you a good review of what happened over the first 50 years or so of this research. The Nature Fix by Florence Williams is a book that I'm currently reading. It's got a lot of good information. It's very accessible as to how we interact with trees and how trees improve our stress and physiology. And a lot of it comes down to chemicals that trees release called VOCs, which is volatile organic chemicals. You're probably familiar with them, if not by that name. This is what causes forests to smell the way they do. This is what they put into those little pine trees you can hang from your rear view mirror. So it's these chemicals, and what we're finding is exactly how they're affecting processes within our bodies. So some of the benefits that we get from interacting with trees, one of the big ones that's been focused on is stress reduction and recovery. We saw a lot of this during the pandemic when people were writing articles about how they dealt with the lockdown by going to the park and being out in nature, being among trees. Well, what we're finding is that some of those chemicals, those VOCs the trees are releasing, are what is driving that. For a long time, we've known that if you grow up in a neighborhood where there are trees, you are much less likely to get asthma. I've read recent research which indicates that if you have asthma, living among trees will reduce the severity of your asthma attacks. We're also starting to tease out, we know the human biome, which is all of the stuff that's in your body that's not human tissue, particularly the bacteria and things in your gut, affect particularly allergies and autoimmune diseases. What we're starting to see is that living in a more diverse environment leads to a more diverse internal biome, which would reduce the incidence of allergies and autoimmune disease. Trees and trails go together. We know that trails that are forested or covered or shaded by trees get 3 times more use than trails that are not. There have been studies, particularly in Chicago, in the housing projects, that having trees and nature near the project leads to more social interactions, and reduces the incidence of domestic violence. We also know that trees along streets reduce traffic speeds. On the economic side, the realtors will tell you that planting a shade tree is a great way to increase the value of your house. We know that trees, or houses that have trees, sell faster and for more money than houses without trees. There are a lot of studies that link well-forested neighborhoods to lower crime rates, because the criminals look at those neighborhoods and know that people are paying attention, which leads to witnesses, which are bad for crime. We get more spending and more people coming to commercial districts. The trees tend to make them destinations rather than just someplace to stop in and buy something. So we get more commercial activity in those areas. pre-pandemic towns and cities that were trying to attract businesses, a better urban forest was attractive to businesses that could locate lots of different places. We also saw greater employee satisfaction, productivity, retention, and fewer sick days among employees in businesses that were in well-treated areas. After the pandemic, as we've gone to more of a dispersed work model, this may not be as true. Nevertheless, we get a lot of both human and economic benefits from having trees in our neighborhoods and in our towns and cities. Unfortunately, we are still facing three major environmental crises, and trees are important for these crises. You have probably all heard about the climate crisis that we're facing. We also are facing a crisis in the reduction in populations of our insects and our birds. So let's look at how trees interact with these three things and what you can do about it. So first of all, with climate change, here is a brief history of climate change. In 1856, so most people don't realize that we have been looking at and thinking about climate change for 170 years. Eunice Foote published the first qualitative result that carbon dioxide is a greenhouse gas. She was able to demonstrate through laboratory experiments that carbon dioxide can trap heat in the environment. In 1896, Ehrenheis, the Swedish chemist, actually sat down and calculated how much warming had occurred as a result of burning coal during the Industrial Revolution. And now he was a Swede, so he thought the idea of warming the planet where they would have longer growing seasons and warmer winters in Sweden was a good idea. He may have had a different take on it if he was from a more moderate climate, but that's where we first calculated global warming is 1896. So again, this whole idea of carbon dioxide and burning fossil fuels warming the planet is not something new. In 1988, the UN formed the International Panel on Climate Change at the request of the Reagan administration. I know a lot of the climate deniers think that this is some kind of a liberal plot, but it was Ronald Reagan who first pushed the UN to start looking at this problem. And in 1999, the hockey stick diagram, which demonstrated the rapid increase of global temperatures over the last 100 years or 200 years during the Industrial Revolution, was published. And what most people don't realize is that graph, and this is what it looks like, a lot of the data that underlay this graph was from tree ring data and from tree ring analysis. So one of the important interactions between trees and climate change is they are a long-term store of climate data. And because of what we have done with regard to dendrology and the tree ring data that we have, we're able to look at climate change over the last 1,000 years. In 2002, Professor Ruderman down at the University of Virginia was studying the models that predicted or tried to explain the Pleistocene, the Pleistocene ice ages. And when he looked at it and he started bringing the model forward into the Holocene, which we are now in, he noticed that about 11,000 years ago, the predicted value of carbon dioxide from that model and the observed value of carbon dioxide started to diverge. And about 3,000 years ago, the same thing happened for methane. Well, it just so happens that 11,000 years ago is when wheat agriculture was developed and started to spread from the Middle East. And 3,000 years ago was when we started to see major increases in rice agriculture in Southeast Asia. The other thing he noticed was in the carbon dioxide record, the observed carbon dioxide record, you could pick out major historic depopulations where farmland was reverting back to forest land in the Justinian plague, which occurred in the late 4th century, coincided with the collapse of the Roman Empire, the Black Death, and then you could also see the introduction of European communicable diseases to the Americas in the carbon dioxide record. He postulated that this was driven, especially the carbon dioxide record, because it was more wheat agriculture, was driven by the conversion of forest land to cropland to forest land. When he first hypothesized this, people said he was nuts, that there was no way Neolithic people could possibly have converted enough forest land to cropland to affect the carbon dioxide levels. Subsequent research has found that that is entirely possible, and this is now known as the early Anthropocene hypothesis. But what it does point to is that temperate forests are incredibly important carbon sinks. And as we convert temperate forests to other land uses, we are reducing that carbon sink and is likely driving increases in carbon dioxide, in addition to burning fossil fuels. We know from the mitigation standpoint, I mentioned transpiration and ambient heat. If you look at this on the left is a map that was produced by the NOAA of heat islands or heat dispersal on one afternoon in August of 2018 in the DC area. On the right is just a Google image, satellite image of the same area. And you can see there's a very high correlation between the low temperature areas, which get down to about 85 degrees, compared to the high temperature areas, which can be up to 102 degrees. That's almost a 20 degree Fahrenheit difference in temperature, very highly correlated with where we have tree covers. This, of course, is Rock Creek Park. This is the Potomac Valley. This hot spot up here is the University of Maryland, and you can see Greenbelt in this area where it's cooler. So we know that trees are going to have an effect on ambient temperatures. And by planting trees or increasing tree canopy cover, we can mitigate some of the effects of climate change. One of the other things to note is, for example, here in Fairfax, Northern Virginia, this is the Route 1 corridor, which is a tree desert, and we have much higher temperatures. This is also where a lot of at-risk communities are found. So trees capture carbon dioxide. Photosynthesis is the only proven technology for removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. They can help reduce energy use, which also reduces the amount of carbon dioxide we're putting into the atmosphere. Flooding is another big issue associated with climate change. And because of the way trees interact with the soils, they can help reduce flooding. They can increase human health. The number one environmental killer today is heat. And most people who succumb to environmental heat have underlying health conditions. So to the extent that trees increase public health, they're also making us more resilient to that heat. There are equity considerations that are associated with it, because the places where we have space to plant more trees, or where we don't have trees are also the underserved or at-risk communities. And of course, planting trees also decreases any other air pollutants that we're um, seeing. One other way that trees interact with climate change is the Blue Ridge. We called the Blue Ridge was named the Blue Ridge because of the haze that was over it. Well, that haze was a combination of water vapor and those VOCs. When the VOCs get higher in the atmosphere, atmospheric chemistry can transform them into seeds for water droplets, because water vapor will not just condense into a droplet without something to adsorb to. And so those VOCs essentially are seeding the atmosphere and creating clouds. And the clouds are reflecting the light that help keep the planet cool. So there are a number of ways trees interact with climate change. Let's now shift to the insect apocalypse. A lot of this broke into public consciousness back in 2018 when this feature article in the New York Times Magazine, The Insect Apocalypse is Here. What does it mean for the rest of life? Was published. Now, Mr. Jarvis, who wrote the article, talked a lot with people in Denmark, particularly is the basis of this article, but what he was pointing to was a significant decline in insect populations. Well, as a result of the increased public spotlight, there was an increased academic spotlight on this issue, and there were a lot of studies that were done after that. And the results were somewhat inconsistent. Whether they were pointing to a decline or an increase or a steady state, but a lot of that inconsistency was based on what species they were looking at, where they were doing the study, and how they were doing the study. Most of the studies in Europe showed a decline. In North America, depending on whether you were doing it in a more rural area or more urban area, we might see increases or decreases, but generally, all of these studies were pointing to a decrease in our lepidopterans, that would be our moths and butterflies, and our bees. So our pollinators they were all showing the pollinators were in trouble. As works with science, we're moving towards a consensus, which is we're seeing a 1 to 2% decline every year, which doesn't sound like a lot, but that means if this has been the trend over the last 50 years, we have seen a 40 to 64% reduction in our insect populations over the last 50 years. In terms of my own anecdotal life cycle, 50 years ago, when I was a teenager, I had to wash the family car every Saturday. And I know that because my dad wouldn't let me use soap or a brush, it was really hard to get all the insect guts off of the windshield and the hood and the license plate. And I don't see that very much. And there are a lot of other people who have remarked on how clean their windshields are after long trips. So there seems to be some anecdotal evidence to support this reduction. Why do we need native trees and native plants to support those insects? Why do we need those insects? Well, for one thing, those insects, particularly caterpillars, are an important source of transferring energy from plants to animals. But we also rely a lot on them a lot for pollination services and for a number of other ecosystem services. Doug Tallamy and his cohort have shown that, in general, native insects rely on and prefer native plants. And the science that underlies this idea is encapsulated by Dr. Michael Ropp, who's also known as the bug guy. He is, I think, an emeritus professor, extension professor of entomology at the University of Maryland. What he says is when bugs bite, plants bite back. And plants produce these bitter alkaloid toxins to reduce herbivory. And with our native plants, we have native insects that have evolved to deal with these chemicals, whereas our native insects are not evolved to deal with the chemicals produced by our non-native plants. That's looking at it from the perspective of the lepidopterans and the caterpillars. If you look at our native bees, about 30% of our native bees are specialized on native plants. And this is particularly with our early and late season flowers. We're also seeing a lot more evidence that some of our early season bees are using pollen from oaks and other wind-borne or wind-pollinated trees. Now, to me, this argument makes a lot of sense because I know a little bit about what's going on in your mouth. You have taste receptors in your mouth and there is one type of receptor for sweet, one for sour, one for salt, one for umami, but we have up to 25 taste receptors for bitter compounds. And I say up to 25% because not everybody has all 25 bitter receptors, which is why there are some people who are not going to survive the apocalypse who think broccoli tastes good, because broccoli and Brussels sprouts and cauliflower all produce these bitter chemicals, but not everybody has the taste bud to taste those chemicals. And the reason we have all of these receptors for bitter is so that we will know if there is a high concentration of a toxin in a plant. And most of these bitter receptors are at the back of your mouth. So it's sort of a last line of defense telling you, don't swallow this, it could kill you. I know in my own family, my sister does not have that bitter receptor. She loves broccoli and Brussels sprouts. As a kid, I had to go outside and leave the house when my mom cooked Brussels sprouts because I have that receptor. So if your kids were picky eaters and didn't like broccoli, it's your fault. You didn't give them the right genes. Another common misconception is you look at a plant like this. This is, I believe, an Asian azalea. This was in my front yard. The previous owners planted it. I admit it's a beautiful plant, and it would be covered with insects when it was in bloom. And to just look at it, you go, well, this is supporting our pollinators. But my wife, who is a volunteer with the USGSB lab and learned to identify bees down to the species level, collected those insects that were on this plant. And what she found was every one of them was also a non-native insect. None of our native bees were coming to this plant. We have subsequently replaced it with native plants that do attract our native insects. But there are a lot of people out there who are saying, oh no, this is ridiculous. We don't need to worry about this. One person who said we don't need the native plants to support our pollinators showed a picture of a European honeybee on a European dandelion to support her argument. Here is a nice little cautionary tale when we start talking about the importance of using native plants as opposed to non-native plants. In the middle is the West Virginia white. This is a butterfly or a skipper that is a federally listed threatened species. The larvae of this insect feed on mustard plants, but the adults, the females cannot tell the difference between a native and a non-native. Cutleaf toothwort is one of the host plants for this butterfly. It's a native. I took that picture down at Mason Neck. Garlic mustard is also a plant that they lay their eggs on, but it is a non-native invasive plant. And to be an invasive, it has to be doing ecological harm. And part of the ecological harm that garlic mustard is doing is that it produces a chemical that kills the caterpillars of the West Virginia white. So when the female lays its eggs on that plant, it's a death sentence for those caterpillars that hatch from those eggs. Why are trees and shrubs particularly important? Well, if you go to the National Wildlife Federation Native Plant Finder, which incorporates research from Doug Tolomei's group, you will and put in your zip code, it'll come back and it'll give you suggestions for plants that will support caterpillars. And you can see in the picture here, every one of them has this little list. So goldenrod support 114 different species of caterpillars in my neighborhood or in my zip code. Wild strawberries are number 2 with 73. But when we look at the woody plants, oaks support 513. And I know Ptolemy's number is up to 590 now. But this is locally native butterflies as opposed to continent-wide. Prunus, our cherries, choke cherries, things like that are 390. So you can see our woody plants support a lot more caterpillars and a lot more of other insects than the herbaceous plants. This is not to say the herbaceous plants aren't important, but you're going to get much bigger bang for your buck when you plant woodies. Bird decline. This is based on a Cornell Bird Lab study. Cornell Bird Lab is one of the premier ornithological institutions in the world. In 2019, they estimated we had lost over the last 50 years almost 3 billion breeding birds. This includes bird loss across 38 families that included starlings and non-native sparrows. We did see some families that saw an increase. Notice that wetland birds seem to be doing pretty well over the last 50 years. But by and large, the birds in this group are the ones that do not eat caterpillars. So what's the relationship between native plants and birds? Well, again, we turn to Doug Tolomei. One of his students, Desiree Narengo, did a study here in the DC metro area using citizen science volunteers who observed chickadee nests. And what they found was that over the 2-week period that chickadees were feeding their young in their nests, they needed somewhere between 6,000 and 9,000 caterpillars, depending on how large the clutch was. Keep in mind that for several weeks after that, the chickadees kept feeding their young caterpillars, but they were doing them outside the nest where they were hard to observe. What they found from this study was that in order to have a sustainable population of chickadees, at least 70% of the woody plants in their forage area, which is less than an acre, had to be native plants. Once they fell below 70% of those woody plants being natives, the population was no longer sustainable. They were not producing enough young to replace the adults as they died. All right. So how do woody plants and birds interact? Well, first of all, woody plants provide nest sites. This is a cardinal nest. They keep coming back to this. That's how I know it's a cardinal nest. This is actually in a Magnolia stellata, a non-native magnolia that we have in our yard. But 75% of birds nest within 20 feet of the ground. So the shrubs are important nest sites. They don't necessarily have to be native. What is important is the forage sites. When the birds start foraging on the leaves and the stems, and particularly the leaf litter, they are generally going to native plants because that's where the caterpillars are. And the reason they're going to those native plants is they are looking predominantly for fat, which is an important part of the birds' diets. And they get that fat from the caterpillars and the berries that are found on the native plants. Now, why do the birds need fat? They need fat for overwintering for our non-migratory birds, but the migratory birds need fat to sustain their migration. For North American native plants, the berries tend to be anywhere from 30 to 50, have a 30 to 50% fat content, whereas native berries tend to be 1 to 2%. And that means that the birds that are relying on the berries, these are particularly our neotropical migrants heading south, because that's when they're feeding on the berries, don't have enough energy to get across the Gulf of Mexico to their North or South American wintering grounds, and they're falling into the Gulf. In the spring, they need the native plants because that's where the caterpillars are, and they need the caterpillars both to finish their migration, but also to get to feed their young. And then throughout the rest of the year, they're looking at the caterpillars and berries. So we need the native plants to produce the berries that have the fat that they need, and to produce the caterpillars, which are nutrient accumulators for them. So that's all bad news. Our birds are declining, our insects are declining, the temperature, unfortunately, is going the other direction. What can you do about it? Well, you can do things like this. This is my front yard. This is about 95% native plants. I did mention the stellar magnolia. I have a few other non-native plants in here, but most of the plants in this picture, in fact, I think all of the plants that you can see in that picture are natives. And it's very simple. You need to use your native plants in layers the way nature does. And layers means you're planting flowers and grasses under shrubs, under small trees, under large trees. When you plant in layers, you're providing the vertical diversity, which creates niches for different kinds of insects and different kinds of birds. Within those layers, you want to get horizontal diversity, which means you're using many species within the layers. And then within those layers, you also want to provide flower or plants that flower or produce berries at different times of the year. A great example of the temporal diversity is 3 of our native viburnums, Viburnum perufolium, dentatum, and acerfolium. That's blackhaw, arrowwood, and maple leaf viburnums. The blackhaw, they all produce flowers that are very similar, that are used by the same kinds of bees. They also produce berries of different sizes. But the blackhaw starts blooming on April 15th every year, pretty much, and blooms until late April. Then we see the maple leaf viburnum starts blooming in late April into mid-May, and then the viburnum dentatum. So having all 3 of those types of viburnums, and you want to get at least 2 of each sourced from different places because they are somewhat self-sterile, you can have viburnum blooms for a month and a half in your yard that's going to be supporting some of our smaller native bees. That's what I mean by temporal diversity. It also means having spring ephemerals, spring flowers, summer flowers, and then late season flowers like the goldenrods and the asters. That's also temporal diversity. And if you have all 3 of those diversities, you are going to be providing an ecosystem that will care for itself, because it will attract not only plant pests, but it will also attract the predators of those plant pests in terms of predatory insects as well as birds. And by replacing your turf with these larger native plants, you're also going to be doing more to fight climate change and provide climate resiliency. One of the important things about this is you need to stop breaking your leaves. I know that that is heretical. I have heard some people complain that it was a communist plot, but people get the message. I should plant an oak because it supports a lot of caterpillars, and then they rake up the leaves without realizing that most of those caterpillars they are attracting to that plant pupate and mature in the leaf litter under the plant. And so when you rake up the leaves, you turn that plant, that oak tree, from a resource into a death trap, because those caterpillars that are feeding on that tree do not have the opportunity to complete their life cycle and become adults and lay eggs of their own. The other thing is that undisturbed leaf litter is good mulch. This is how nature mulches the forest. It's good for your trees. It's good for your flower beds. Even on your lawn, Scott's is now recommending that you mulch up to 18 inches of leaves into your lawn. I know when I've said this in the past, people have got, oh, that gets too deep. 18 inches. If you've got more than that, there's something going on with your trees that's not right. And Scott's is saying you can mulch up to 18 inches. So you don't need a leaf rake. You don't need to spend all that time raking your leaves. It's one of the reasons people say, I don't want to have a tree because I don't want to have to rake the leaves. Well, now you know that you shouldn't be raking the leaves. Another complaint I get is, oh, we're worried that our plants won't come up through our leaf litter. This is my trout lily. It's been growing in a bed where I actually have been adding some leaves every year because it's near my driveway. So I'm cleaning some of the leaves off into this bed. It comes up every year. This year it actually came up and bloomed, which it doesn't do every year, but it has no trouble whatsoever getting through the leaf litter. These leaves, as they break down and decompose, are also enriching your soils. When we moved to our house, the A horizon, which is the organic layer at the top of your soil column, was paper thin. Now it's, after 20 years, it's about 3 inches deep. So what I'm talking about here is changing your landscaping paradigm. Instead of saying turf first, it should be turf last. What I encourage you all to do when we get done this morning is go out in your yard, look at every square foot of turf and challenge it. Ask it, why are you there? What are you doing for me and for the world? And if it can't come up with a good answer, dig it up and plant a native plant. I know there are a lot of native plant sales going on right now. So this is a great opportunity to start to turn that landscaping paradigm around. And I encourage you to do it in your front yard to be a good example for the neighborhood. You can further that by putting up signs. I know that I'm in a little bit of a competition. I don't know if he knew it, to have the most sign with Ellen Ford, to have the most signs in their front yard. We have all these signs. We actually went out and bought a trellis to put them up. I have seen my neighbors stop and read these signs, and I'm hoping that this is changing their behavior and what they're thinking about how they should be landscaping their yard. One of the pushbacks I get from people is, oh, they're native plants, and I'm really nervous about taking care of native plants. I don't know how to take care of native plants. Well, here's what native plants need. They need sunlight, they need carbon dioxide, they need water. They also need oxygen and nutrients. And the reason they need these things is sunlight, carbon dioxide, and water is photosynthesis. And oxygen and nutrients are cellular respiration. If you remember when I talked about the life cycle benefits of the trees, it's all driven by these two processes, which are the same processes that drive our non-native plants. In other words, our native plants are plants. If you know how to garden, if you know how to take care of plants, the non-natives that you get that we've been bringing home from the nursery for all these years, then you know how to take care of native plants. It's just a question of bringing home a different suite of plants. Now, there is one caution that I would give you that I learned, is that there are plants that may be native to the region, but not native to your yard. One of the first books I got on gardening with native plants talked about foam flower and how beautiful it was. And it is a beautiful plant, and how easy it was to grow. So one of the first native plants we tried in our yard was foam flower, and it died. And we tried it again, and it died. And we tried it again, and it died. Foam flower may grow well, particularly you notice it's growing in a pot, and it's doing very well in the pots that are full of soil that we went to our local nursery and bought. But in the sandy clay that we have in our yard, it does not do well. So there's going to have to be a little bit of experimentation on exactly which of the natives are good for your yard. Some of the resources. One of the ones that I like is the Homegrown National Park. This was a serendipitous organization that started. Doug Tolomei used to talk about if we just got rid of 20% of or 50% of our turf, we could create the Homegrown National Park, which would be 20 million acres, which would be, and this will give you an idea of how much turf we grow in the US. It would be greater than in area than all of these parks combined. I happened to be a marketing person in one of his talks, and they got together and they started the Homegrown National Park. Another place that can support this is plantvirginianatives.org. If you go to their website, this is their banner. You can see all these little pictures along here. These are all logos for various regional plant campaigns. This is probably the best one. This is the bumblebee moth on our native coral honeysuckle. There's its caterpillar. The reason I think that's a great logo is because it was my idea. That's the logo for our local native plant campaign called Plant Nova Natives, which you can access at plantnovanatives.org. And there you can find the native plants for Northern Virginia. The Virginia Native Plant Society also has a lot of good information on native plants. If you want something a little more specific, you don't want to have to go through and tease out which plants to plant, you can use the Native Plant Finder. And if you just search on Native Plant Finder, it'll come up. Click here, put in your zip code, and that's where I got those two, or that slide for the recommended natives based on the number of butterflies and moths that these plants support in your neighborhood. Another good resource is the Virginia Plant Atlas. This is more for if you're thinking of planting something and wondering if it's native. For example, if you're thinking of planting this is Shrubby St. John's wort. Sorry, my Latin is not working this morning. You can see all the counties that have red dots is where this plant is native. This is a great midsummer bloomer to have in your yard. It's really important pollinator supporter because we don't have a lot of stuff that blooms in the middle of the summer. If you are really ambitious on the native plant or the atlas, you can go to the county and you can get a list of all of the plants that grow in the county and whether or not they are introduced or native. Another good resource is the Department of Conservation Recreation, Natural Communities of Virginia. These are driven mostly by soil type. So if you can figure out what your soil type is and what the natural community that would grow on that soil type would be, it can give you a leg up on what to plant there. If you are in the coastal plain of the county and you have sassafras soils, which is what I have, these are very acidic soils. So what you're looking at is something like an oak heath forest, which is why I have such great luck with my native azaleas and mountain laurels and blueberries, which are all acid loving plants. At the very least, be aware of this. This is the list of invasive plants. And even if you're not sold on using exclusively natives or mostly natives, at least don't plant anything that's on this list, please. We are spending a lot of money to remove them. All right. I was asked to talk about tree care. I'll do that briefly because we're starting to run out of time. Native trees are well adapted to our current water regime. You can overwater them, which will add stress. So I recommend, because trees can pull soil moisture up from as far down as 4 feet, use a soil or water meter to determine when you need to water your established trees. This is not about newly planted trees, but for established trees. If the soils are dry down to about 3 inches, then you want to start watering them, and you want to give them a good deep soaking to rebuild that moisture well down into the soil column. So use a soaker hose and water it overnight. Open your hose bib about a quarter of a turn and just let it run all night. That should give it enough water. But for the most part, we get enough rain to support trees in this area. One of the bigger issues in landscaping is turf. Turf likes different soil conditions than trees do, and they fight each other. One study out of the Morton Arboretum found that you get 5 times more tree root mass under mulch than you do under turf. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about green mulch or brown mulch. So reducing turf under your trees is a good thing to do. You can use green mulch in there, which means planting natives under those trees. That's that layering that I talked about. This is what trees aspire to look like. I haven't seen any studies that say how far out your mulch ring should go, but since we know that mulch is good for tree root mass, the further you go, the more your tree is going to like it. Here's an example of a happy, well-mulched tree. What's mulch supposed to do for you? It moderates soil temperatures. It keeps the soil cool in the summer. It keeps it warm in the winter. It helps reduce moisture loss from the soil, so it's keeping it moist. If you're using an organic mulch, it's feeding the soil food web. If you're using a wood-based mulch, you're feeding those ectomycorrhizal fungi that are particularly important for our trees. Good mulch should also allow gas exchange and help infiltrate water. As it turns out, probably the best mulch you can get are the wood chips from an arborist. And as you can see, I took this picture in Warrenton, just happened to pull up behind this guy at a stoplight. Frequently, they can be free. You can try using chipdrop.com, or if somebody's having tree work done in your neighborhood, just go talk to the guys. They're always looking for places to dump those wood chips. This is, unfortunately, is what we're using commercially most of the time. This is a really bad mulch. This stuff is finely ground. You can see it got dry and it cracked. Your mulch should not be doing that. That means that what's happening is this is locking together. This is almost like craft paper, and it's forming a water and vapor barrier. So I mentioned green mulch, and this is what green mulch is. It's the idea of growing native wildflowers, native shrubs, native small trees under your big tree. So here I've got, this is golden ragwort and mayaples. This is actually, it's a non-native rhododendron under a dogwood. And then there's a big willow back here that's overarching all of this stuff. Some ideas for green mulch. Let's see. I think at this time, Trish, maybe I'll stop and take questions unless people want me to run through these different plants.
Kripa was wondering if you had any words of wisdom or words of solace after the Virginia General Assembly just named the honeybee as the Virginia state pollinator instead of a native bee.
I was not aware of that. My wife is really the bee person, but I think that that was really short-sighted. That was probably driven by the agricultural interests, because that's where honeybees are important. I'm sure that, you know, I would have preferred if they had gone with something like the rusty patch bumblebee, which we do find in Virginia, but it is a federally endangered species. But the downside of that is if that thing goes extinct, then we don't have a native pollinator. The other issue is our state insect is the tiger swallowtail, which is also a pollinator. So I don't understand having two different insects for that. All I can say is that planting native plants is going to be good for our native bees, but they're also good for honeybees.
Her second question in relation to that was when people say save the bees in general as a way to mitigate climate change or other things. How do you feel about that? Should it say something about native bees? Because having a beehive, that doesn't necessarily do anything for the problems that we're talking about.
So I'm going to rely on something I heard from Sam Droege, who is the director of the USGS Bee Lab and one of the leading native or Eastern native bees specialists, is that you can have really good honeybee habitat that sucks for native bees. Because remember, I said about 30% of our native bees are specialists, whereas honeybees are generalists. They will use our native plants, they will use the non-native plants. I showed you that and you get honeybees on that, but it's no good for our native bees. So you need to have the native plants to support the native bees. And I think the idea of and this is the issue, is we tend to ensile these things, and that's part of the point today is if we use native plants, we can address lots of different issues the same way. So I think, yeah, it would be important to point out that if we want to fight climate change by supporting our pollinators, we need to be supporting our native pollinators, because that's going to be doing more than just fighting climate change. It's going to be supporting our native insects, because when we're supporting our native bees, we're also supporting, you know, goldenrods. We have several native bees that specialize on goldenrod. So if you plant goldenrod to support those native bees, you're also supporting 114 different native lepidopterans. And then there's the stuff that feeds on all that stuff, and lots of other things. So using those native plants is addressing a number of different things, where supporting honeybees, you may only be doing that. That may be all you're getting out of it, is supporting honeybees. You're going to get some climate change issue support there too, because they are such generalists.
I had a question about your recommendations on mulching trees. I still see a lot of landscape companies and even Fairfax County making the mulch volcanoes around trees. That's not good, right?
That's bad. Yes, that's bad for the tree individually, because what you're doing, mulch volcanoes are where you're stacking up the mulch very deep, right up against the trunk of the tree, and it's causing the tree to grow adventitious roots out of the trunk where they're not supposed to grow. Um, it can make the tree very dependent on the moisture within that mulch, but it can also um, increase pathogen or create homes for pathogenic fungi. So there are a lot of bad things that are associated with that. One of the issues, and I know what you're talking about, Trish, is around the Heritage building. It looks like they're doing mulch volcanoes. But when I've dug down into it, what I found is they're only putting 2 or 3 inches of mulch there. The problem there is that when they planted those trees, they only buried half of the root ball. So they planted them very high. So while it looks like it's a volcano, it's just that the way they've been planted, they're standing up above the rest of the landscape, which is not the way you should plant trees. The root flare should be at grade. One of the advantages of those wood chips, especially when they are green right straight off the truck, is that you can mulch up to 6 to 8 inches, which actually will keep the weeds down. In fact, one way to get rid of turf is to get those green wood chips and spread them out 8 inches deep on top of the turf and let them sit there for a growing season. That'll pretty much take care of any weeds in the grass. And then at least when you're dealing with woody plants and things like that, you can plant directly into those wood chips. The one thing that if you are already have a big tree and you want to start introducing more stuff underneath it, choose small stocks so you're not digging big holes in the root system of that established tree. The tree can take some small holes where you're only cutting small roots, but if you start cutting big roots to plant, 10-gallon shrubs underneath, you're going to damage that tree. So plant small and let them grow into their space.
I just did a chip drop and am trying to load up on the 6 to 8 inches. It is a lot of wheelbarrow trips.
It is a lot of work. My wife and I did it, and that's the basis of part of our what you call it.
We have a question from Pete, sorry. What's your opinion on double shredded hardwood mulch, and you already answered how many inches generally, but there are different kinds of mulch.
Double shredded, I wouldn't go more than 3 inches deep. If it is really hardwood mulch as opposed to just the outer edges, which is mostly bark, it's okay. Single shredded is better because you got more gaps. But the thing about the difference between a wood mulch and a bark mulch is the function of the bark is to keep water inside the tree. So bark is what is called hydrophobic. It's got a lot of waxes and things in there. It doesn't absorb water. In fact, it repels water. So when it rains, that's the stuff that floats away. Wood, on the other hand, is hydrophilic. It loves water. Its purpose is to hold and absorb water. And so using that hardwood mulch and the stuff, that's why the wood chips from the arborist are so good, is because there's a lot of the inner part of the tree. That stuff will absorb water and it'll stay in place. It'll actually get waterlogged and sink during rainstorms. But certainly if you can't find single shredded, double shredded is better than bark mulch. And that stuff that I showed you, which is triple or more shredded, that was actually designed so they could blow it. they could attach a blower to a dump truck load and just blow it off instead of having to load up wheelbarrows and wheel them around.
Hey, Trish, this is Bob Pearson. Do you mind if I bust in? I can't use the chat for some reason. I have to name somebody. Hey, Jim, thanks for a great discussion here. I got a question about for planting long life trees, like a willow oak, for example, or other trees that might be living for 100 years. Should we take into consideration the future climate change of what it's going to be like here in 100 years for a 100-year-old tree, or 300, like ball cypress? They live long, white oaks.
Yeah.
Should we plan for the future? Thanks.
That is an open question in urban forestry. Do we plant for today's climate or for the future climate? It really depends on what you're looking at. Like with willow oak, I wouldn't worry, or white oak, I wouldn't worry about it because we're right in the middle of its native range. But if you're looking at, for example, I wouldn't plant sugar maple or basswood because we're right at the southern edge of their native range. So 50 years from now, they're probably not going to be very happy. The other thing, though, is that it's not just genetics, it's also the phenotypes and the way the tree responds to the genes. We're seeing a lot of trees that are succumbing to the environment as it's gotten warmer, but that's because they grew up and they adapted to living in a cooler climate. So when we're planting the trees today, they're going to be better suited to that. But in general, my recommendation is don't plant anything that's at the southern edge of its range. Don't plant, or if you can, source your plants from like North Carolina or South Carolina, where their genotype is a little more adapted to what we think the future climate's going to be. But still, you want to try and stay with plants that are native to the region.
So the loblolly pine should be okay, right?
Yeah, loblolly is moving. They grow here already. We're at the northern edge of their native range. There's some speculation, particularly on the eastern side of the Chesapeake Bay, that the only reason they aren't further north on that side naturally is because getting across the bay with the seed source was difficult.
Yeah, one last quick question.
I've seen southern magnolias overwintering in our forests now. So they're beginning to be, we're beginning to get a climate that is adapted to them, whereas the northern edge of their range is really Virginia Beach.
May I ask one quick question? I'll shut up. So the loblolly pines, when do you think is the latest I should harvest them? I don't want them to fall over into my house, but some of them are 50 years old. Should I be looking for harvesting some of these loblollies? No?
No, loblollies native, they will live to be 150 to 200 years old. We harvest them when we do for commercial purposes. Also because they will start to get too big for the mills if you let them go too long. But if you're not without commercial consideration, there are beautiful loblolly pines out at Conway Robinson State Forest that are 75 years old, and they're showing no signs of issues.
I must have 100 of them. So they also say that you should remove the pine needles, or the pine straw, they call it, every 3 years from underneath these loblollies.
I don't know who says that. Again, that could be a commercial recommendation because that is a commodity.
Yeah, for plantations, I guess. Okay, thanks, Jim. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bob. Most of us don't have a space for loblolly pines, I don't think. You're lucky. We had a comment from Betsy, and Dina recommended this as well. You can get a visit from a representative from Audubon at Home. I'm going to put the link back in the chat now, and they can help you with a consultation on native plants in your own property. And then Jim, I hope it's all right. I dropped your email address in the chat as well.
Okay.
If people have further questions. Too late now, right? I did it.
Yep. It's out there. One comment I'll make on the wild strawberry, this is one I really like as a ground cover and substitute for English ivy. Not only does it spread well, we also have some native bees that specialize on this. This is the only plant they go to. And I would point out, we're talking about wild strawberry. Notice it has white flowers and it has 3 leaflets. We have a non-native semi-invasive cinquefoil, which has 5 leaflets and yellow flowers. But we also have native cinquefoils, which are great ground covers as well, and can be, as my neighbor has demonstrated, can be used as substitutes for grass because he has a really crappy lawn, but it's full of cinquefoil. Any other questions?
There was one I didn't get to that I hopefully answered correctly, but can you just verify? You were mentioning fall layering seasonally for fall asters would be a good option.
Yes.
Along with the goldenrods. Was that what you had said?
Yep. Here's,
Okay.
Whoops, wrong way. So wild petunias are a good sun blooming plant. These things seem to bloom all summer long in our yard in different places. Goldenrods, the great thing about goldenrod is it doesn't matter what your conditions are, there's a goldenrod that fits it. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of goldenrods, and there are lots of them that are native to this area. This is a sun goldenrod. We also have shade goldenrods in our yard. The aromatic aster, this picture was taken in October. Compared to, first of all, the New York asters don't do well in our yard. They tend to be real scraggly, but this is only like 3 or 4 plants. So this is a really good fall blooming plant for your yard. The coral honeysuckle, this is what they're looking like right now that we're in the major bloom portion, but these things will bloom on any new growth and they will bloom all summer long. I have pictures of the flowers and ripe berries in the same photograph because these bloom into October and November in our yard. And if you're really lucky, you'll get these snowberry clearwings or bumblebee moths, which host on this plant. Then if you can take acid, you've got mountain laurels. These are all examples of what are known as green mulch. The Pinkster bloom azaleas, these are another acid-loving plant, obviously. And circled here, there's that snowberry clearwing, nectaring on the native Pinkster bloom. And this is the shrubby St. John's wort, which blooms in the summer. Another summer blooming shrub, not necessarily native to this particular part of Virginia. It's more of a southeastern native, but sweet pepper bush, Clothyra alnifolia. Do not get candy floss, which they have bred to have pink flowers. One of the issues with the cultivars is when you change the shape or color of the flower or the color of the leaves, they lose their ecological value because part of that coevolution is the shape and color of the flowers or the color of the vegetation. If you don't have a space for a big shrub, there is a variety or a cultivar of this called hummingbird. And the difference is, because I've got a hummingbird in the front yard and a straight species in the backyard, the only difference between the two plants is the length of the internodes. So the hummingbird is gibberellin is what causes plant cells to elongate. It's gibberellin challenge, so it's not elongating as much as the native species. Otherwise, the flowers, the leaves, everything looks exactly the same, but you're getting a more compact shrub. So, and there you go. That's my contact information.
We did have an announcement from Wendy, who wanted to mention the Fairfax Invasive Removal Alliance, a coalition of homeowners, citizen, and condo associations looking to get the Fairfax Board of Supervisors to deal with the invasive plant crisis. And she put the link in the chat if you scroll up a bit there in the chat box. Are there any other final questions for Jim before we wrap up for today? If you want to raise your hand, we can unmute you and you can ask. And if not, we are going to say thank you, Jim. That was
You're welcome.
informative
I'll
and
see you all
entertaining.
this afternoon at Eagle Fest down at Mason Neck State Park. My wife and I will be down there representing Plant Nova natives. And what do you
Excellent.
think, Ellen? Who has the most signs?
Alan already put in the chat that you win, Jim. So congratulations.
But Alan has something that I wish I had. He's been cited by the weed police.
And that's a badge of honor,
Yes, it is.
I assume.
We did have one more person raising their hand, Helene. You may have to unmute yourself by clicking the microphone option at the top, but I think we have time for this one more question before we wrap up.
Thank you, ma'am. Helene Cooper here. Jim, thank you so much. That was just a plethora of fabulous information. Apologize if this is kind of a, duh question, but I do have the old leaf blower sucker mulchers. I'm guessing that it is bad to actually put our leaves through that and then put them back down. Does that actually destroy the larva?
It does.
Okay.
There are two reasons that I drop my head and I shake my head on that. First of all, as you said, when you suck the leaves through that thing, you are destroying that habitat. And then you put them back down. And I did one time, I was doing a management plan for this group, and they raked up the leaves in their forest garden and replaced it with leaf mulch. And I just shake my head because that's a lot of extra effort that you don't have to go through. A much better use of your time is sit in the shade, have an iced tea, observe your garden, enjoy yourself, rather than, and I've got pictures. If you've ever been to the I-66 transfer station in the fall, they have this huge pile of bags of leaves that people have raked up. And I'm just thinking of all the resource that's involved in doing that. And then what they have to do is either put down fertilizer to replace the leaves that are gone, or they're getting mulch to replace these leaves. And all they had to do was nothing, and they would get good mulch. So I was trained as an economist, and I see these things in terms of resource allocation, resource utilization, and what you could be doing else with your time besides all that leaf raking.
Thank you, sir. I also understand that that leaf blowers are one of the worst uses of energy.
Gas-powered leaf blowers, yes, those are 2-cycle engines. They're putting out a lot more pollutants. They don't have the kind of pollution control. There's also the noise pollution associated with them. There are many towns. In fact, I was just reading, I just started that article in the latest Scientific American about how bad noise pollution is for us. So yeah. And
we had a presenter last time, Jim, Neely Law from the Office of Environmental and Energy Coordination of Fairfax County, who mentioned something about a ban on county property for when they're doing maintenance, an upcoming possibly ban on 2-cycle engine leaf blowers.
Yeah. I had a neighbor who fortunately has moved away who had a leaf blower fetish. It was like every night he was out there blowing his yard with that gas-powered leaf blower. And what they were saying is that the decibels from those things, even inside your inside your house exceeds EPA recommendations. So
Great.
yeah. I've been trying, when I was working, I tried to get Fairfax County as part of their Earth Day celebration to have a leaf rake bonfire. I've become convinced that that is the most environmentally damaging thing that we put in the hands of homeowners.
Well, thank you for your advice, opinions, insight. I think that that is all of the questions that we've had pop up, and I hope that everybody has a wonderful rest of their day at the Eagle Fest to see Jim.
Yes, it's
or
going to
wherever
be
you
a
end up.
beautiful day. Come out, walk the Bayview Trail. There's lots of great shrubs along there that have either already bloomed or will be in bloom.
Thank you, Jim.
Okay.
And hopefully we'll see you all at our July 13th green breakfast for the next one. Have a good day, everybody.
Bye-bye.